outside of the fundamental question of life and death, this is the biggest question for American Zen. What is American Zen? Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I see someone named NYZ online. Hello, my name is Giun. I don't know if I've really met you or not, but it's nice to have you here. This is supposed to be a short, relatively informal Dharma talk. I think my hope is that this particular day's talk can be more interactive than normal. So unlike what we might do for Teisho, I'd like you to turn on your thinking brain for this. And NYZ, you online, feel free to unmute yourself and pipe in as appropriate if you feel inspired. So we had one of our Zen Studies board meetings, last Monday or so, and we were talking a little bit about a big anniversary coming up for our monastery. Some of you were on the board, some of you were there. How old is DBZ next year? 50. So the Shoboji where we're sitting is 56, I think. Yeah. And DBZ is going to turn 50 next year. And in addition to that, fairly recently we had this big transmission of the Dharma baton where Chigan Roshi became our third abbot. So we're in our third generation now, freshly, and our training monastery is about to turn 50. And these numbers are all just numbers, but somehow to me it feels like there's a moment of shift here. And it's not obviously any one split second, but something changes here. You know, we were talking about what to do to honor DBZ's 50th anniversary next year. And in the past, a lot of times we've gone to great expense and effort to invite guests from Japan for this kind of an occasion. Noritake Roshi, Kobayashi Roshi, Yamakawa Roshi, all these folks have come and participated in our big events in the past. And Chigan Roshi commented that we certainly might invite folks like that because we love them. But that we don't need to go out of our way to try to hook them into coming for an event like this time, because we don't need Japanese teachers to come and authenticate what we're doing here. You know, we've been doing this in the monastery setting for 50 years now, and again, to borrow Chigan Roshi's phrasing, we've managed to get the diapers off. There still might be shit all over everything, but we've managed to take the diapers off now. And so I've just been reflecting on this, and my views on this larger subject that we're about to dive into have changed a little bit over time, but somehow now it hits me harder, the contrast between Japanese monastic Zen, where we get our tradition from, and this practice that's happening right here in front of us today, which, you know, if I look around the room, most of us are not Japanese, most of us are not ordained, and that's true of the Sangha, and that's true of the wider United States Mahasangha. In the US, it's mostly a lay practice, and it's mostly a householder practice, and it's mostly people who don't come from an Asian ancestry. So the big question today for all of us is, what does that mean for our practice? And so that's what I want to kind of dig into a little bit right here. I know I am guilty of doing this, and I think probably I'm not the only one. I have in my mind sort of this romanticized idea of what Japanese Zen is or was. And I'm using that as the gold standard. I'm using that as the reference standard. Anytime there's a question about what we're doing here, or how we're doing it, or what it's supposed to look like or feel like, I'm referring back to this. But it's just an idea. and it maybe never existed at any actual time or place. Nevertheless, what is that idea? To acknowledge what that idea is. What do we think we know about Japanese Zen? What defines it? What are its characteristics?
Ceremonies, rituals, things like that.
Ceremonies, rituals, yeah, for sure.
Elegance and rigidity.
Elegance, rigidity, yeah. Who are the practitioners in Japanese Zen, mostly?
Monastics.
And even more specific, where are those monastics coming from? Why are they at the monastery?
It's a family village.
Yeah, it's a family thing. So at least since the Meiji era, since the 1870s, most of the monks in the monasteries have been the sons of temple priests. And you understand why they're there, why they have to be there, roughly speaking. So legally speaking, the monasteries, the training monasteries, own all the branch temples. And so for a son to take over his father's temple, he has to go to the training monastery, to the Senmon Dojo, for 3 years or 5 years to receive the certificate from the training monastery. Yes, okay, this person can run a temple. And what is important, or what are the important differences between that setup and all of us in this room?
We are not from our father's lineage. We're not being passed. It's not passed down from my dad.
Yeah, this is not a hereditary thing for us. Our parents were not Buddhist priests, as far as I know. What else?
We're lay. Most of us are lay.
Most of us are lay practitioners. I'll roll off a couple more. I mean, some of these are so obvious, but they're the important ones. Those folks are all Japanese, for one. So that culture is shared, and that culture is quite a bit different than American culture. It's hard to overstate how different they are in terms of conceptual cultural stereotypes. All the folks in that system enter the monastery when they're like 19 or 20 years old. So they're all men. They've all grown up in temples, so they've grown up in formal Zen their whole lives, and they show up in the physical peak of their lives at the monastery. And the monastery has 3 years to form them enough that they can be sent back out into the public as both competent officiants of all of the ceremonies of the school, and also as sort of honorable representatives of the Zen school. And you bundle all of those factors up together, and that ends up meaning that the monastery life can be extremely rigorous. It's supported by the whole culture in that sense. The time is limited, and the guys, it's almost all men who are showing up there, they know it's this finite amount of time, and then it turns into a profession that will sustain them for the rest of their lives. So all of these factors built together, they're willing to and able to put up with a great deal of physical stress, a great deal of cold and deprivation and discipline and being shouted at, all of that together, okay? And at least in the back of my mind somewhere is this idea that like that's what Zen looks like, right? Like, especially in the Rinzai school, it's brisk, it's vigorous, it's difficult, it's highly disciplined. But also where we're getting that from is from a specific time and place in culture where it works, where the whole structure is built to let that work, okay? So, hi, Mike. So also, part of what I wanted to talk about also is how that whole thing is fading out, right? Are we aware that the overall size and participant level in Zen in Japan is shrinking, has been shrinking for decades? About 4 years ago, I came across an article written by a monk named Kogen Tsarnik. He was born in Poland, and then he went and practiced in South Korea and in Japan for more than a decade. And he wrote this article about this phenomenon that Zen is, I don't quite want to say dying, but it appears to be dying, shrinking in Japan. And I wanted to underscore that a little bit too. Do you mind if I read like 3 paragraphs from his article? So he runs over the numbers first. You know, in the Soto school 4 years ago when he was writing, there were only 4 Soto monasteries that had more than 10 monks. And in the Rinzai school, it's harder to get the numbers because the Rinzai school is not as centralized, but it's pretty similar. You think of all the great training monasteries, there are probably only 4 to 6 of them that have double-digit monks practicing these days. Okay? So, quoting from Kogen, Zen teachers and students have been repeating the phrase, Zen in Japan is dead, for decades already. So what, you may ask, is the big deal? Why would it matter for practitioners in the West? Interestingly, this phrase was coined by Japanese teachers when Japanese Zen was still pretty alive. A BBC documentary from 1977 on world religions captures a memorable moment in which the reporter asks Yamada Mumon Roshi, who was at the time the head of Myoshinji in the Rinzai school and president of Hanazono University, about his declaration that Zen is dead in Japan and should be re-imported from America. Mumon Roshi replies with spontaneous laughter, saying, "Indeed, that's how it has become." Mumon Roshi attended the opening ceremony of Daibosatsu Zendo and visited Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, and he must have loved the fact that lay people were coming not for priest certification or out of familial obligation, but purely for practice. There was a freshness in it that had already been lost in post-Meiji Japan. But at this time, when Zen was just beginning in the West, there were still dozens of great Zen masters teaching in Japanese monasteries with lively and intense practice. Each of the Japanese teachers who came to the West had undergone some of this traditional training. I'm still quoting, over the next 40 years, a couple of generations of Western practitioners were still able to go to Japan to immerse themselves in the fire of traditional practice, rarely found in the West, before returning to their home countries. For some, those were the most formative years of their practice. Many of the teachers currently sharing Dharma in the West, or their teachers, had undergone some training in Japan and found a great value in it. To me, that's one of the important parts. Found a great value in it. Still quoting, others might have found all they needed for realization in Western settings, and that's great. I am writing from the perspective of someone who trained for over a decade in monasteries in Japan and South Korea and found traditional monastic training immensely valuable. Not only was the intensity of practice on a whole other level from what I experienced in the West, but there was also a quality of becoming and acting as one body with the entire community, which is especially helpful for people from the individualistic West. Forgetting personal preference, opinions, understandings, and just surrendering to the relentless succession of forms and practices designed to point continuously to true nature has great power. Of course, everybody who participates in a session in any Zen center can have this experience to some extent, but in traditional monastery life, it doesn't end with the end of session. It's a way of living that permeates one's whole being, demanding continual surrender of self-centered perspectives. At my home temple, Bukokuji, under Tangen Roshi, we were not allowed to read, write, or go outside the gate, or talk unnecessarily to each other. 365 days a year, every single morning started with zazen and chanting. Every single meal was formal and silent. Every night there was zazen for 3 hours. We did everything together. When we washed dishes, after drying a plate that belonged to a cupboard on the other side of the kitchen, I could hand it out and let go of it with closed eyes, being sure that some other hand would pick it up in silence and put it in the right place. Without personal space or time, we did zazen, takuhatsu, which is begging, ate, slept, prostrated, worked, and chanted as one. I knew almost nothing about my Dharma brothers. I didn't know their education, where they were born, etc., but we knew each other intimately like the left hand knows the right. So there's a couple of things about this that are really big for me right now. One is the massive contrast between the contexts of the Japanese Zen where we found our tradition, so to speak, and the American Zen where we are practicing right now. These contexts are very different socially, etc. And another thing that's big for me here is what Kogen is saying about the value that so many practitioners have found in the Japanese monastic system. Whatever is good or not good about the American practice, a lot of folks who've had a chance to practice in the Japanese system have found that there's a real beauty and a power there. And at the same time that we're saying this, in the West, our new abbot is saying that we've taken the diapers off and that we no longer need Japanese people to lend legitimacy to what we're doing 3 generations in. Well, that might be good because at the same time, the Japanese tradition that we are borrowing from is on the sharp decline. So this is where I pause to take a sip of water and just, you think, what does this mean for our practice? So what does it mean for our practice? So you're saying we can localize some of the ceremonies and traditions more to here, to the US now, since that's where we're sitting. Maybe changing clothing, maybe changing the language we chant in, maybe changing prostrations. Admittedly, that's sort of a foreign thing to most Americans. So, okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm repeating a little bit for the sake of the cameras, but so we do, in our Sangha, we tend to use a lot of the Japanese terms for things. And part of what you're saying is that we could translate more of that into English so that it was more readily accessible to somebody who doesn't already know this basket of terms. We did finally post a little glossary up on the bulletin board in the Dharma
I
book.
hope you said.
Yeah, good. We'll ask about that later. Does anyone, yeah. Yeah, so there's this element that we, at this point we have the ability to make some conscious, deliberate decisions about how this evolution occurs. Yeah. To me, this question mark, this is outside of the fundamental question of life and death, this is the biggest question for American Zen. What is American Zen? To what degree and how specifically do we change the source traditions from which we're drawing our practice? American Buddhism either comes from Japan or Korea or Vietnam or Tibet or etc. It didn't start here. And so it has to change. I mean, that's one thing we can agree on right out the gate. Like, the cultural context is so radically different. It cannot be the same practice. That would make no sense. So it has to be different, and then it's just a question of how. How does it have to be different? And a lot of thoughts float around when I reflect on this. One of the things that comes to my mind is part of what brought Soen Roshi and Giun Sensei together is that they both agreed that there was a lot of fresh excitement about trying to transplant Zen into the United States because the political structure of Zen in Japan was already so ossified. They didn't want to deal with it anymore. They felt like the rigidity of the hierarchy of the politics in Japanese Zen were getting in the way of Zen, and they thought that in America there was a chance to start over. I also think about, for myself, and I know so many others who have practiced in somewhat more traditional modes, it's been so valuable. And I'm well aware of the irony of me saying this. I've never set foot in Japan, so I've not practiced in Japan. Even the shift in the last 15 years in our Sangha of the way DBZ works, some of what was enriching to me has been let go of in that period of time. And so what do I do with that? What does Chigan Roshi do with his experience training at Mount Baldy, which was relatively traditional, and now he's supposed to set the tone for us here, how to do that. On the one hand, we know that some of the strictness was very meaningful, and some of the Japanese cultural parts were very meaningful. I would echo what Kogen said here. The Japanese emphasis on collective action and homogeneity, that's really valuable for a Western mind, because we are so excited about individualism. I think the US now maybe even has gone past that, and we're excited about the persona that you project beyond the actual individual. So to step out of that and into a context where, as Fujin liked to say, you matter less than the dust on the floor. Yourself, your individual self, is absolutely not the focus. And to experience that has a lot of spiritual value. But it is, again, it's the antithesis of stereotypical American culture. So what do you do with that? Another thing that I think about is, most of us are householders. You all have day jobs. Even I am sort of straddling the line between a monastic existence and a domestic life. So we're not living in a monastery. We're not practicing year round. We're not doing session once a month and mini session twice a month. So how do you practice? One of the things that comes to my mind is that one of the books that meant a lot to me was a guy saying that, yeah, sure, if you have a day job, it's valuable to set aside some time and do intensive retreats, because you can do sort of a maintenance practice in householder life. You can sit every day. You can sort of maintain a foundation, but what really allows you to sort of push the dial, push the meter on the, I hate using this phrase, on the depth of your practice, is these periods of intensive focus, is doing session or doing some kind of other retreat. And he said specifically 5 days is a good minimum, because if you're going to do an intensive retreat, you have to assume that you're changing the whole context of your daily life. It takes you a couple of days for your mind to move past what your daily life has been. And then once you get to the last couple of days of the retreat, your mind again starts to think about what you're going to do when you get back. So you need at least one day in the middle where your mind is not trying to make a reference to the past or the future, and you're just doing the thing. Footnote, that's why we celebrate middle day during a session, not because we're excited it's half over, but because the middle is the best part. My other thoughts sound preachy, but I'll rattle them off quick anyway. I think one of the things this means for our practice if we're householders is it's very, very worthwhile to view your whole life as practice. You're in the temple once a week, maybe twice a week for a couple of hours, but your whole life is the Dharma. Your whole life is your practice. Your whole life is your life. And you can change the character of that life by doing the things you do, whatever they are, as practice, as shugyo, as dharmic activity, making all of those activities a kind of offering to the overall beauty of the universe, instead of just doing everything you do to try to get more money and have more snacks or whatever motivates you. And the other thing that comes to my mind is specific to this current time and place. It's good to be careful about distractions. Even giving this Dharma talk, allegedly, I've got a screen on each side of me. We've got 2 screens for 7 people in the room, and I'm glad that we're able to share with the folks out there. But we all carry this thing around in our pocket, which is very carefully engineered to play on our neurochemistry to get us to look at it all the time. And that's not the best for maintaining a clean and focused state of mind. There's just a great deal in this culture right now that is vying for our attention. We all know that. and the ways in which it vies for our attention are carefully researched and highly funded, and it's not a surprise that it works a lot of the time. So, acknowledging that, if we want to be Zen people day to day, we would be wise to keep an eye on that aspect of our lives. Keep an eye on how much of our mental energy is just sort of diffusing into the atmosphere by looking at things that aren't really important. So I don't feel like these are really, I feel like this is more of a question than it is an answer. But it is one of the big questions for us. We are so lucky to benefit from this very deep and still well of practice for centuries in Asia, in our case specifically in Japan. And so many folks who've managed to dip their toe into that have found it to be so beautiful and so impactful for their life practice afterwards. And it may be that that well is drying up. It may be that it is harder and harder and harder as the years go by to access that. And also, we've been kind of doing this for 3 generations now in the US. So at some point, we have to be confident that we're doing it an acceptable way. So we're right in the middle of that right now. It's shifting right now, I feel. And it is up to all of us, mostly subconsciously, but it is all up to all of us to take this where it needs to go somehow. So, thank you for your reflection, and it's not over.